Since we're all just waking up and it's the end of a long but rich week, let's stay in the dream mode for a bit. I want to play you a few minutes of one of the most beloved songs in the country, "The Raglan Road" by Luke Kelly, inspired by the great peasant poet, the troubadour of the bog, I sometimes think of him, Patrick Kavanagh, who was in correspondence with another famous poet here, A.E. He was a bit of a mystic visionary poet, which brings up, as everything does, another story, because James Joyce once got a loan from A.E., which he never paid back, but he did send him a note, A.E., I owe you. If you remember nothing else this week, remember that one. So A.E. was also representative of a certain Dublin aristocratic view of literature, and Kavanagh was a country poet, already having mystical visions, very Catholic, but also a kind of Celtic vision in his poetry, locked in the land, you might say. And A.E. invited him to visit in Dublin, but in those days you didn't have internet, there weren't even any bus systems, so Kavanagh walked 70 miles from the north of Dublin down here, and it took him a while to even find a place to stay. He ended up going to the Archbishop of Dublin, and the Archbishop found him a place, and eventually it got him a little job working for one of the newspapers. One day he's walking down a little road called Raglan Road in the southeast corner of Dublin, and he's 40, just about to turn 40, and he spots this raven-haired beauty named Helen, I believe, some Moriarty's. I have to get her last name. And he immediately fell ass over tea kettle in love, as Grandma Dora used to say. And this song comes out of that because it's a very rich mix of the moment, almost Dante-esque, like the famous moment when Dante himself encounters or meets the young, some say 12, some say 14-year-old Beatrice. Imagine, this is a vision that inspires the Divine Comedy, for goodness sakes, and it was right outside of his little tower in Florence. It was a flash moment, but it was a flash of something divine in his imagination. So if you have flashes like this, get them down. And by the way, in pen and paper, not on your iPhone. If you've had to do that, shift it as quickly as you can, because a different kind of voice or note-taking will take place on an iPhone that takes place with real pen and paper. The minute you pull that up, you start to think of the internet, you start to think of friends and texts. It's jarring. Notebooks have their own numinous quality for all writers. As a matter of fact, again, we'll be a little jumping around, but these are all rich stories, right? All rich stories. My friend Mort Rosenblum, anybody who comes to Paris next May, you'll spend several days with him. He's one of the most important writers on the political scene in the world today, and that will be my co-leader in Paris. He's lived there for many years on a houseboat on the Seine, and we'll have several meetings on his houseboat right there on the Seine, bringing in local writers in the Paris scene and so on. And a couple of years ago, he had a bit, not really a writer's block, because he's always writing something, but he's at a period now, early 70s, where he's thinking of what Somerset Maugham called the summing up. What have I done? What have I yet to do? And we were talking, and he was reaching out to me. Cousineau, what do you think? What do you think I should do? What? This guy nominated for 4 Pulitzer Prizes for international reporting. And I remember watching him. He has these flip notebooks, which are have always been very popular among real correspondents. And even during our lunch, he's taking notes like mad. And I look at the way he's doing it, with this fierce sense of attention, hanging on words, but also making notes of what's going on around us. And I said, Mort, what about your notebooks? Write about your notebooks. He's writing about his notebooks.
Yeah, right on.
Thousands of notebooks. And it's a collective device, you might say, for a lifetime of reporting, because notebooks are holy. They're sacred to a reporter, but also to anyone who's living writing for a living or writing from the soul. Okay? There's my little cell for this. In the meantime, Patrick Kavanagh encounters this beautiful woman who seizes his imagination. He begins to not quite stalk her. It wouldn't have been threatening in any way. The sexual mores of the time were much different, but he was deeply enraptured. Something different than love. He was enraptured by her. And he followed her around a bit, and then he wrote this poem that it appears, because there are some accounts of him going to pubs like McDade's, where I think some of us went a few years ago, and the Bailey's, which is also another famous literary pub in Dublin. And there's evidence that he actually sang it, and he sang it to an air, as they say, of the line will come to me here. One of the famous traditional airs, a few hundred years old. Now, so you have somebody that wants to write about a magical encounter. He has transcended. We've been talking about this. If you have an experience of transcendence, of being transported from one world to another, from in a dream, in a love encounter, whatever it might be, get it down. Even a handful of magnetized words, get those images down. He did, and it appears he had the melody in the back of his head while he was writing this. So I've been hunting around. I've loved this song for many years. I've played it for many groups and many different sites. But I went up on the web this morning, which I can't get here. I would actually quote it because the internet, it just keeps going in and out. And I just saw, there's a new piece written by an Irish journalist here. Maybe it is coming up. Oops, sorry, it's a little too early. Where he went to the Bailey's pub in the spring of 1964 with the poem, with a specific intention of giving it to the lead singer of the Dubliners. Now, this is Luke Kelly, has one of the most memorable, powerful, transcendent voices, I think, of the 20th century. He helped form the Dubliners, and the Dubliners began playing at O'Donoghue's near St. Stephen's Green in the early 60s, and it's argued that those sessions at O'Donoghue's is what helped launch the whole folk revival here in Ireland. So this voice, that group, the Dubliners, if you want to take home any Irish music, get the collected Dubliners. There's Wild Rover was their biggest international hit, but the Whiskey Song is on there. My Little Town, several songs about Dublin itself, about the countryside. But this moment really amazes me. Imagine you've written a beautiful poem, you want it sung, you know that it's got legs, as they say. And then you actually go, Kavanagh was a very, very shy country fella, always wore rags, he was always being mocked walking around Dublin, what do they call him, he would wear his wellies around Dublin, he had these old suit coats, he always had this old, what they call paddy cap here. And they made fun of him. Everybody in Dublin was making fun of him. But he goes to this pub, and the legendary singer Luke Kelly is there, and he gave him this song. And there are a couple lines here that I'd like you to listen for, because what Patrick Kavanagh is saying about what he's in his many conversations as he's wooing. Remember that old word, to woo, that comes up in this. He's
to brave.
That's
a Princess Bride story.
Well, if it isn't, it should be.
Sorry.
To woo is to romance, to court. It's not used often anymore, but he uses it in quite a beautiful way here. But it becomes a moral issue for him. How long do you try to court somebody? What if they are refusing you? So an issue comes up similar to something I heard Hillman say a lecture once in Pacifica, where he says, every time you try to seduce somebody, you lose a little bit of soul. Isn't that something? And Kavanagh knows that here. He knows it. By seduce, I mean try to persuade, elbow. someone into doing something either romantically or sexually that they do not want to do. And if you are of a certain ilk, you might get away with it for a while. But Hillman is suggesting, and Kavanagh is admitting it here. He's doing something a little bit more than Hillman. He's admitting that he may have done this with perhaps the love of his life. So this is a very raw song emotionally, but it's also quite beautiful because it captures in a way I know has been rarely captured in a song the moment when the heart flares with love. Well, let me go back to the beginning.
On Raglan Road of an autumn day, I saw her first and knew that her dark hair would weave a snare, that I might one day rue. I saw the danger and I passed along the enchanted way, and I said, let grief be a fallen leaf at the dawning of the day.
The Dawning of the Day is the old Irish ballad.
On
It
Grafton
borrows the
Street
melody for this.
in November, we tripped lightly along the ledge of a deep ravine where can be seen the worth of passion's pledge. The Queen of Hearts still making tarts, and I'm not making hay. Oh, I loved too much, and by such is happiness thrown away. I gave her gifts of the mind, I gave her the secret sign that's known to the artists who have known the true gods of sound and the stone, and word and tint without stint. I gave her poems to say, with her own name there, and her own dark hair, like clouds over fields of May. On a quiet street where old ghosts meet, I see her walking now, away from me so hurriedly. My reason must allow that I had loved not as I should, a creature made of clay. When the angel woos, the clay he'd lose his wings at the dawn of day.
We just listened to that all day.
Yes.
On
I guess
of an autumn day.
so. Synchronicity lives. Of course, I do listen to this all day. Once in a while, this is one of the songs I will put on a loop if I'm reaching a deep, you might say, emotional Gordian knot in the work. How's that for a phrase? Emotional Gordian knot. Remember the story about Alexander the Great, the Gordian knot? Well, we can Google it later. Talk to Mr. Google, as I say here. Can you find something? A snort of Connemara whiskey like we had last night? Or just the right song? And it can get you through these emotional knots. Just a couple things. One is, well, Kavanagh is he's not seducing. He's rapturously in love with this young woman, but there's a huge age gap. He's 40, she's 22. And this is in the late 30s going into the early 40s. It just was not done in those times. So he's giving her the secret signs. Did you hear that line? The secret signs throughout time. This is what lovers have done. What is he trying to do? And finally, at one point, she says, "Would you stop writing about the bogs and the dark gray skies of Northern Ireland? Would you write about something else?" This is what he wrote to her. A couple of other lines. "I love too much by such and such is happiness thrown away." Good grief. I gave her the secret signs. "Let grief be a falling leaf." These are beautiful. It's all images, line after line after line of images, which have numinous power. It's a different kind of power than ordinary prose. "I had loved not as I should." Beautiful, beautiful lines in there. He's reaching out. He's hoping that this poem, among other things, will induce. How about induce rather than seduce? Induce her to love. It's a shade of meaning. A few years ago, on one of the tours, we ended up in Dublin, and I brought in this woman, Mary McGeehan, Maghean. I believe she was a nun, and then she found the poetry of Patrick Kavanagh, and she left the church, and she started to write about him, and now she leads tours around Patrick Kavanagh's Dublin, and it is enchanting. We, a couple of years ago in the rain, do you remember? We went to the corner of Raglan Road where he first saw her. What's the line? "Her dark hair could be a snare that I might someday rue." We know that. We know that moment. I see vigorous head nodding right now. We know the moment. So we stand there, and we were in the rain. We had 4 or 5 umbrellas, and we sat under. She had this tiny little CD player about this big. We all huddled under this umbrella at the very spot where Patrick Kavanagh saw her for the first time, and we played this song in the rain in the afternoon. It was really enchanting.
I saw a clip from that.
Sorry?
I saw a clip from that.
Oh,
Sacred Earth Journey.
Did you? Oh gosh. After a while, your life is out there, and you lose control. You lose control of it.
Richard, were you there?
Were you on that tour?
Yeah, but that was when I went on my own to get soap for Heather.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Lemon soap?
Yeah.
So
The lemon soap from
James Joyce.
the little pharmacy that is
Oh, yeah.
mentioned in Ulysses, where Leopold Bloom is. He is trying to woo his wife back. Molly Bloom has been having an assignation, as they used to say, and he wants to woo her back. So he buys her a bar of lemon soap. It's quite romantic. And that tiny pharmacy is still open. Sweeney's. And there's a fella behind the bar who I just took my group there last week. He's dressed all in the traditional white garb of a pharmacist at the turn of the century. And you walk in and he says, "I have just finished reading Ulysses for the 40th time." The 40th time. I don't have any other tings to do. They don't pronounce the H here in Ireland, by the way. That's why you'll hear it ting rather than thing and so on. So he's quite charming. If you find yourself back there in Dublin, He reads 10 or 12 languages. And every afternoon there's a reading from something in Joyce. Last time I was there with James, this old friend of mine, we walked in, and there were 20 people or so, all dressed in period costume from the Dubliners, dressed as characters in the book and then in the movie, and they were reading the short story, The Dead, when we walked in. And immediately the owner, who I've known for years, just thrusts a copy of Dubliners in my hand and the other one in Jazz. You walk in, you are participating, you are reading. This is the living word here in Ireland, rather than literature delivered to you as my grandmother used to pinch my nostrils and pour castor oil down my throat when I had a cold. This art is castor oil. You should read this, and this would be good for you, and this would charm you. No, this is living. This is the power of living literature.
Phil, does anybody know the band Silly Wizard? They're an Irish
No.
There's this song called The Queen of Argyll, and it's a similar thing. It's like this man sees this beautiful woman, and he rushes back to tell his friends, and he begs them not to court her because he wants her for himself. And the chorus is, "And if you could have seen her, lads, boys, if you had just been there. The swan was in her movement and the martyr in her smile. All the roses in the garden would bow and ask her pardon, for none could match the beauty of the Queen of all Argyll."
Well done.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. With that in mind, one more time.
Yes.
All right.
On Raglan Road of an autumn day,
If anybody knows the song, just
I
chime in.
saw her first and knew that her dark hair would weave a snare, that I might one day rue. I saw the danger and I passed along the enchanted way, and I said, let grief be a fallen leaf at the dawning of the day.
I imagine you know this.
On Grafton Street in November, we trip lightly along.
Can you sing that?
Jesus.
Of a deep ravine where can be seen the worth of passion's pledge, the Queen of Hearts still making tarts, and I'm not making hay. Oh, I loved too much, and by such
That's a good start to the day.
Well said. That's a good start to the day. Oh my, that's right. We've been talking about the enchantment of language. And if you don't fall in love with words and images like this, then writing may not be for you. But if you swoon with these words and images, it might be for you. So,
You have a nice place for swooning this little oasis.
a nice place for swooning. Here. That's why we're here. We could be in the Hilton in Galway. What? No, we're out here.
I think with the trees here in this kind of setting, lads, yes, it's easier to swoon.
Thank you. I feel vindicated. So,
No, I was just thinking there.
yes,
Paddy
excuse me.
Kavanagh.
Look, they won't know who you are. So, this is my good
Lucky
friend.
lads.
Thank you. This is my friend Leo Hallisey. Is that who?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. So 2 years ago, after that, my group 2 years ago left. I was here for I think 2 weeks after that, and I found myself going down to the I call it the Letterfrack 7-Eleven here.
Yes.
And I just bought a couple of bottles of Red Bull and a notebook or something. I'm standing outside looking at this beautiful poem that had been memorialized and put on a piece of local wood and nailed onto one of the slates from the Christian Brothers School. And I'm wondering, who does this? Who would do something like this? I love this. I love it to see it in cities all around the world. A little tap on my shoulder, and it's Leo handing me a flyer explaining what it was. But he was so humble. I love this out here. You didn't tell me that this was your idea. You just said, would you like to know a little bit more about it? And of course I did. And I wrote to you later on. And from here, and then we met down at Molly's pub, because he said there was a great session happening. One of the greatest Elan pipers was going to be playing that night.
Yeah.
And we stayed in touch, and later, maybe was it last Christmas, you were in San Francisco and called me, and we went to my local cafe, Cafe Trieste, legendary cafe in North Beach. I thought we were just going to have a cup of coffee when we walked in. It was the annual Christmas Eve party there, and local Italians from all over Northern California came in to sing Christmas carols. And it was as close as you can get to a session, an Irish session, as you could ever find in America. And you happened to be there. I think you called the gods in that day.
Yeah.
So I invited Leo to participate with us this year, and he's graciously agreed to come and spend a little bit of time with us. So thank you, Leo.
That concept of oasis, that meeting in San Francisco was an oasis, and it was so like here in the sense that you had this eclectic mix of people of a good age, most of them. You had the opera singer who was maybe past her best but was still striving for the high note. And you had that amazing sort of mix, and it was just like being at home. But it also was, I felt it kind of humanized the big city of San Francisco, because here was a village, and here was a group of people in this a small unit inside a big unit, having a great time and having fun, and very old-fashioned kind of fun.
San Francisco crack.
Yes, and the feisty Italian lady went around and knocked the money off the clients. Nobody was getting in for free, and nobody was getting out without paying. You know, just like you get in for free and you have to pay to get out. So it was that kind of, and you were listening to the words of Paddy Kavanagh there, and Paddy Kavanagh was kind of I lived in Dublin that time with Paddy Kavanagh. Paddy Kavanagh wore boots always, because it reminded him of being a countryman, lost in the city. And it was a sad old time that sometimes dressed up as a fun time. And if you were to put another lens in it, you could say it was a seedy old time at times. There was a desperate lot of loneliness, there was an excessive amount of drinking, and there was a kind of sadness there at the core of that. And sometimes that's romanticized and it's given the Celtic lens now, which, do you know, there was a group of hugely talented people who produced very little in terms of output. I often think if they had been Europeans, I know it would be a different sort of stuff, but that we're writing about, but their output was tiny, because you can't be a professional drinker and adhere to sticking your pen on paper and making words jingle or whatever they do. and it's only at times that happened, that magic. You know, that was the sad thing about it. That sometimes it's nostalgized, whatever that kind of word is, or it's presented through a romantic prism. It wasn't a romantic time. It was a sad old time, and our country, that was a dark period in our history. So many writers were on the banned list. So much of society living was restrictive. I certainly felt caged in. I was a teacher down the dockside in Dublin at the time, and it was very much a caged in society. And then eventually I came here in '74, Connemara. And I came here because there was a sense of freedom in the air in this place, which there wasn't in other parts of the country. I grew up in Clare, County Clare. That'd be a very historical county. That's where the Burn is and all of that beautiful karst landscape. And there'd be a great sense of history there, but in many ways they were prisoners of history. Whereas here, the church hadn't ever done a good job here. I don't know whether it was maybe the roots were too pagan, too wild, all of the good things about Connemara, like there's a landscape that's out there that's wild, and the winters are big, the ocean is big, and then if you hear Connemara music, like say if you hear, there's a group there called the Hernans, and they would epitomise what Connemara music is about. It's wild, it's fast, and there's no time for breathing. Like this is it. If the father who leads that group is a flute player, and people think, oh Jesus, he starts, he won't stop. He'll keep on playing and playing and playing and playing, and tunes and tunes and tunes. And fiddlers, their fingers, you'd see them afterwards, and they're all under the table. If they have big egos, they won't want to see you. People see this, but under the table they're doing this, trying to get their hands, because he's after knocking the stuffing out of them. So that kind of wildness out there epitomises, I think, what I was looking for at that time, anyway, was that sense of freedom and not being hemmed in. Because the Catholic God of my youth was very, you'll find it runs throughout the literature anyway, but you'll find that it was very oppressive time, you know, and a dark time. And the poetry trail came out of that darkness because village of Letterfrack is a Quaker village, and set up in the 19th century. And then afterwards, of course, the church wouldn't have liked the notion of Quakers being out here amongst the peasant Irish Catholic, and they'd be losing control, because a lot of it was all about control, you know. So they moved in quick enough when they got the chance. And the Christian Brothers came in here. They opened the Borstal, or a reform school for boys. And a lot of bad stuff happened in that place. And it's a stain on our area. And sometimes the word Letterfrack would be associated with abuse and nastiness and the grey side of things. So
Parents would threaten their children.
yes,
With Letterfrack.
yeah,
The
cop yourself
name
on, or you
sent an
Yeah.
ice pick of terror through a child.
yes, yeah, it would, yeah.
Fair to say.
Yeah, it would, definitely. And the whole area was Dickensian. And you know, like,
Oh,
as a teacher, when I look at it and you say, you're trying to reform or reshape some of the kids that need to reshape. Some of the kids were sent there because they had no parents, they were orphans, or at that time, if the woman died, the man, it was perceived that the man wouldn't be able to look after children, and sometimes the children were actually put into care, simply because it was a male parent who was left. So there were a mixed bunch of people that were there for various reasons. They weren't, and sometimes say some of my past pupils in the docks in Dublin, they were sent there, but they were sent there for tiny misdemeanors like stealing $5, that kind of money, or maybe kicking the police car, or doing some petty thing that's of no consequence. But they were sent there. I remember one of them came back from Letterfrack, and his name, I can still remember his name was Mixer Bollard, That was his nickname, Mixer, because there was a big tradition of like Joxer and Mixer, and like in O'Casey came from the same place in the docks where I taught school in East Wall. And the school is now called, actually, it's a local community centre called the Sean O'Casey. So it's a kind of full cycle. And Mixer came back and from his holiday, in inverted commas, in Letterfrack, and the first thing he did was he had got some grey suit from the outfit that he travelled in. And the first thing he did when he arrived home was he stripped off and he burned his suit, in a ritual burning of the suit. And if you said to him anything afterwards, if he wasn't on his best behaviour out in the yard, you said, "Jeez, Mixer, I think you must be thinking of going west again, are you?" He said, "Sorry about that, sir." That was his great thing. "Sorry about that, sir." And
How old would he have been?
he'd have been 12. So anyway, a community either deals with that stuff in two ways. Some communities bury that stuff and it's unspoken about. And that's happened in some areas in our country, and it happens across the globe, that communities say, "Oh Jesus, that past is awful, so it never happened. We don't talk about that stuff here." And people change the subject. Now, it's still a difficult subject for us to talk about, but what we were trying to do is that through the arts we talk about, we could talk about the subject. So what we did was we set about, we got some money through a government agency, and we commissioned 9 poets to write 9 poems about place, about the importance of place in their own lives and the importance of place in their own writings. And it was a very loose brief, so there was nothing on, we never asked them to sanitize it or to be polite or to not deal with the subject full on or full frontal or whatever. And they're 9 of the most eminent poets in the country, and our poet laureate of the time, I think she's called Professor of Poetry for Ireland, Paula Meehan. She was our poet laureate anyway. A terrific poet, working class poet, actually came, or people who would have come from the same sort of milieus where I taught in the docks in Dublin, where people came from inner city as well. So she has a working class background. She's a very scholarly lady and a great poet. And I rang her up and said, "Would you write a poem?" I'm ringing from Letterfrack, and she kind of knew who I was anyway, and so forth. It's a small pond in Ireland, so if you hang around long enough, you're going to be known in spite of yourself. So,
In spite of yourself.
so she said to me, "My God, that's serendipity." She said, "I stood at the little graveyard where those children are buried in Letterfrack 20 years ago, and I intended to write about that because it touched me, because it touched my life, because my people and all of that, my people would have been there." And she said, "It's amazing that you, 20 years later, you're asking me to write a poem. So I'm an easy target." She said, "Hands down, I'd be delighted to write the target." Because we weren't offering big money. I think it was €300 a poem or something like that, if a poem has a price, but that's what we could afford and all of that. Anyway, so she wrote 2 short poems, and I'll read them for you now. And that kind of kicked off the thing. Then once you had a well-known poet like that, then it's easy to get the others then, because no matter what the group is, there's a certain sheep element in the whole thing, that if you can get the main ram in the door or whatever, all the rest of them will follow. So if you can get a leader poet or a leader writer, you can hook the rest of them, and we hooked the rest of them, and they wrote lovely stuff. Some of the poems are tougher than others. There's 4 or 5 very tough poems, and the others are the general celebrations of place. So that was the loose brief. I was terrified that the likes of a board Falcher or a tourist board would get a hold of this thing, so that then you'd have a group of 9 sanitised poems, and we'd be playing Happy Clappy. And we'd be in fantasy world and saying, "And the Irish lovely, and haven't they a glorious past," and all that stuff. Whereas these are tough poems, but I think they're cathartic, and it's. And then the next part of it then was that the poems would be accessible, that there wouldn't be any sense of privilege or about around the thing. And in order to do that, we put them up in public places. So there's 3 poems in the village, 1 outside the shop and 2 outside the 2 pubs. Rita Ann Higgins has a poem on the door of Molly's, just outside the door of Molly's. It's a very tough poem. And the owner said to me, Jesus, he said to me, you gave me a tough fucking poem, he said. And I was absolutely thrilled because he read the poem, you know. And I said, sure, that's the way, Jerry, you know, it's a simple subject, you know, we can't dance around it. He said, yeah. So that was it. And he didn't, now another publican could literally have said, geez, I want that taken down. I don't want my premises to be associated with blah, blah, blah. And he didn't. So fair dues. And I was absolutely thrilled that he read the poem, because a lot of people, with the poem would be there, they'd be walking past it for 75 years and they wouldn't have read it. So he read the poem. And the poems, as you mentioned, they were printed on large, which would be a timber that would be used in the boat building here. And then they were mounted on slates from the building, just to show that like there was some change happening, all of that. They were designed in the Conservation Centre of Letterfrack. And there was 3 poems there, 3 poems inside in what was the centre itself, which is now with the Conservation Centre and the Furniture College, the 3rd level institution where people they do up as far as master's level. And beautiful things are made there, and beautiful things are restored. So I love that whole notion, particularly the restoration business. The President's Carriage was restored recently. Shackleton's hut, the great explorer, was restored there. So I like that element to say that here's a community rising out of the ashes that has turned around, and we're turned into the light, and we're in a good place. And I think I'd like to think our village is now a kind of it's a headliner for an ability to change, that we're not locked into the past.
Through the arts.
Through the arts,
Yes.
through the arts.
It's a kind of exorcism.
It is, yeah, it is. Because there's 3 poems there, and then there's 3 poems up in the National Park. And I think the journey, that when you walk through that journey, there is a sense of pilgrimage. I'd like to think there's a sense of pilgrimage about that journey. And there, it's a time for reflection. It's a time to be with yourself. It's also a time to be with Letterfrack and the past. And it happens to be our history, but it's everybody's history, you know, our story, and it's everybody's story. And every community has darker stories that are, sometimes we're like the cat, we cover them over. And then we have this thin veneer, and it breaks out in other ways again, you know, in a society that doesn't deal with stuff, you know. So in 2014, the President of Ireland came, and he opened our festival, which is Connemara Sea Week. And I give you some brochure now there, so another time you might.
You could pass these around, and if you're struck by it, you could buy a copy, which helps the Poetry Trail project. And there's a CD.
There's a CD in the,
of the poets reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very
Gretchen.
much. Thank you.
Buy one for yourself and one for a gift for somebody back home. And I believe that this is a potentially award-winning edition. It's beautifully designed. Of course. Yes. There are extras, and I believe they're only €10. It's one of the great bargains in Ireland right now. May I pass these as well?
Oh yeah, the brochure. Oh yeah.
So this is the brochure that
The festival.
he happened to have on. Oh, this is the upcoming festival.
Yeah.
I had mentioned that as well in honoring of the rescue boats and so on. Can you pass that out?
Can I buy another one? Is there an extra?
Yeah, but we have-
There would be, yes.
Yeah.
There's
Okay.
an extra, yes.
Yes, yeah. In the CD has oh yeah, sorry, Michael D, the President of Ireland, opened it in 2014, and then he was chuffed with it. So he's a poet as well, and he gave us a poem then I kind of said, come on, because he was our local representative, so I would know him on a different basis as distinct from citizen president. So he would have been our public representative for years. So I said to him, come on, give us a poem for the trail. So he did. In actual fact, he forgot to send on the poem then, and then we were invited up to the Oris, to the president's place for some occasion. Oh yeah, it was Bloomsday, and when he saw
It's
me,
a celebration of Ulysses, by the way.
Yeah.
Bloomsday.
when he saw me, he said, oh, his conscience got the better of him. He said, oh, he was waving at me. He's a small man. He was waving, saying, "I have the poem."
A president who writes poetry. Do I have to point out the paradox?
I felt
Jesus.
I felt I was like a poem hunter, like the
Poem
hunter. The poem hunter has come to town, and the president is waving. His guilty conscience saying,
Or the
"I
po-
have the poem.
Or
Forgive me." I
The
have the
poetry
poem."
whisperer.
So
Oh, marvelous. And that's in the book, right?
it's the opening poem in the book.
The opening poem.
By
By the
and
president of
then
Ireland.
he actually reads it then on the CD.
Wow.
And on the CD as well, there's some music by these young players from our area, best of the young players. They're all under 20, and so the music you'll hear the harp and flute and being played in there, and then you'll hear what we call Shannon singing, traditional singing in Irish, and on there as well as a young singer. He's when he was hanging there, he's only 16 and a half. He's now a big star. He at the All Ireland's, this big competition for musicians and that, he won something like 7 prizes, and somebody was asking his mother, and he was kicking her under the table like this. I could see him saying, "Shut up," you know, because if anybody asked him, "How'd you get on?" he said, "Grand." Well, not too bad. He won 7 first. Like. He's a real young genius who carries. You know, he's a real artist. He has a modesty about his trade. He knows that it's difficult, and he's willing to learn. You know, so he has all the elements of being a great artist, which he is already. Like, and you'll hear him on this. There's a connection here. Do you see the image on the front? That's from an American New York artist, Mary Frank, that image. And there's a connection there with Jack Kerouac, because her husband was Frank, the famous photographer.
Robert Frank.
Yeah. And they were friends of Jack Kerouac's. I said that so this is a kind of a literary quiz now of you heads that should know. There's some connection between this book and Jack Kerouac. Anybody can tell us. I mean, you'd want to be up early in the morning to figure it out. But anyway, nobody did. But,
And we drank in the cafe where Kerouac wrote part of On the Road.
is that right? Oh, that's
Cafe
the
Trieste.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
right. And we were sitting one seat away from the chair where Francis Coppola wrote the script for The Godfather.
Oh my God.
There's a reason why I lured you over there.
And that image there that's another Mary Frank image. That one there, going with Michael Dean's poem. It's a powerful image, I think. And, you know, particularly in this time of displacement, where so many people across the planet Earth are displaced and moving and homeless and so forth. So, if you go to Letterfrack, the first poem that you'll actually meet, say, if you can approach the actual poetry trail from 2 ways. If you go into the park, you can approach it from that end, or if you go into the village, you can approach it from the other end. So we'll pretend we're going into the park. And Theo Dorgan, he's a Cork poet based in Dublin. He's married to Paula Meehan, so they have a poetry industry in that house. 2 poets together and dancing around one another, maybe at times too. And it's a gentle poem of hope, I think, and I like the way it's so understated, and it's in those spaces in between. Most of what needs to be said is said, and it's in the unsaid, and it's called Waystation. It's on page 11, and Theo Dorgan, and it's true of many stories like that. But there were many stories that weren't like that, because at the time there was a big, strong sense of fear across the country in terms of authorities, that still hadn't shackled off. We still were suffering from that post-colonial stuff, don't raise your head above the parapet. Keep your head down. You'll bring them down on you. Them being authorities. You'll bring them down on you. That was out there in kind of unsaid. You didn't want to have guards calling to your house or police people calling to your house. You know, that would be a shame. You didn't want authorities looking at your tomb. Maybe you weren't paying all your taxes. You know, the morality that the church at the time was peddling was sexual morality. From the navel down was morality. And anything to do in terms of social morality about contributing to society or anything, that was not spoken about at all. So that was the kind of time. So that when these boys escaped, in most cases they would have been handed up because they would have been afraid to hold on to somebody because the authorities would be after them. The guards would be calling to them and blaming them. So this gesture, understated gesture, was against the tide. You know, so it was a little beacon of hope, and there weren't that many beacons of hope in that dark landscape of the early 20th century, you know, when this place was at its, in the 40s and 50s, when this place was at its worst, you know. Mannix Flynn wrote a book about Letterfrack as well called Nothing to Say. Mannix Flynn, you'd be able to find that, I'd say.
Okay.
And he actually, he wrote about, he did a play. As one of our festivals, he came back to Letterfrack into the hall in which he was abused. That's the local hall. And he had a play based on his medical records. It took him ages to get those records, you know, the way authorities fasten down and they can't find things and things are missing. He was labelled insane when he was only 15 and he was on Largactil, heavy doses of Largactil. So he wrote this piece then where he runs through the story of this boy, but he puts a different name in it, but it's actually his own story. But he has this kind of remove by putting another name in it. And it's an amazingly sad story. And he presented it as if he was a barrister. So he had a Louis Copeland, would be the big tailor in Dublin. He had a Louis Copeland suit, which was a bit of a joke at the time, and saying, Jesus, look, I'm after spending a whack on this suit, you know. And he had this dress suit, so he looked like a barrister from the law courts, and he presented it in a kind of that fashion, as if he was presenting a case objectively. And it was some of the most it was one of the most powerful theatrical evenings I had ever been at. That he came back, and then you had this deal with me. There was no money involved. Everybody was free in. And he invited people from the legal profession and from a lot of authority figures as well there. And it was just really special. And it was very good for him because it was unfinished business. And he was coming back to face the demons head on and to deal with that awful past. It was really brave and it was very elegant the way the whole thing was done.
And the name of the play again?
Nothing to say.
Nothing to Play was the book, and you'll find if it's the same guy.
I had nothing to say.
Nothing to say.
Nothing to say. Yeah.
So Mannix Flynn. did you
Mannix
say?
Flynn.
Yeah.
Mannix Flynn. Yeah. But you'll find his other. When you come across him, you'll find the other one about the play as well. Anyway, this is kind of that's the context in which this poem comes out of. Like a lone cottage, the wind clattering an unhinged door, damp reek. Vetch and bindweed climbing to empty windows, scabbed lichened plaster peeling, rust red corrugated threatening to take flight. Nothing unusual here. Common sight in this tumbled landscape of rocky bog, of wind-shorn blackthorn, stubbornly rooted on ditches, scant grass, the glint of oil and water on shabby fields. A brother and sister lived here. Neither had married. They kept to themselves but were friendly in company. Sometimes he'd take a drink, but was never offensive. At a wake or a christening, sometimes she might sing. All this I learned from an old man who had stopped to chat. The tale and its variations, I'm hearing it since I embarked on this long course through empty parishes, unpeopled countryside, lanes closing in on silence. I was being measured as we sat there smoking, the man turning me over in his mind. There was more I knew. Two things we always noticed, he said eventually. His eyes on a pair of ragged crows battling the wind. There was a light left on in that kitchen all night long, and the half door to the cowshed was never shut. Nothing was ever said, see, but we loved them for it. I startled. It was not a word I had expected. A desperate boy breaking out and striking for home would see light, slide by, find the door open to shelter from rain and cold. Bread and milk, dry straw, and an old coat. He stood and stretched. Good people, he said. I admired them. A pause. Men came from all over to their funerals. So that's an opening poem. And Paul Meehan's poem, companion piece, is on page 19. And this, as I said, is a boy coming from a city boy, from an inner city boy, coming from a working class background, and he's coming out here into this open space. That's page 19. Paul Meehan's poem, companion pieces. There are two pieces: the Talbott suitcase and the boys from Gloucester Diamond. That's the place where she was from. That place herself, Paula Meehan. The cardboard suitcase. And in Ireland, in Irish sort of lore, the cardboard suitcase is always associated with travel to America, travel to England. It was always the cardboard suitcase, you know. There was nothing grand about that mode of travel. People were going and they wouldn't be coming back, you know. And you were in Inishboffin yesterday. There was a great singer in there in Inishboffin, Desi O'Halloran, and he was telling me he was singing over in Boston in a pub called the Burn. It's a famous musical pub outside at the edge of Boston, and there's a graveyard not too far from there, and a lot of people from Inishboffin are buried there. And some of his older relations, like they were close, like older brothers, I think, he had never met them, and they were buried there. He said it was a really emotional day, the day he stood in that graveyard, and so many people that he knew so well, but didn't know at all, never, and was closely related to them, all carrying cardboard suitcases, had gone there and never to come back, because at that time the travel was extremely difficult and so forth, and only letter writing was the only thing that kept those kind of contacts alive. So this is the cardboard suitcase. All he brought was his native city, its jade green river, its street sellers' cries, hooves on cobbles, feral cats who crept the grimy docks, old men with pigeons whistling up winds, his granny's window, the yard below, his mother's apron, his sister's handbag, its smell. He slept beyond reach of the fists, the lies. He dreamt beyond reach of our pity. The boy from Gloucester Diamond. What did he know of bogs? Their beauty, the names of their flowers, their wild skies? We cursed those cold, black-robed men who swept the four winds and the four known seasons out heaven's door, down on us below. They were beyond all sense, all reason. By an unmarked grave we knelt and wept, spoke of his head of curls, his green eyes, his broken back, his small hands empty. So they're tough ones. And I'll finish. The last poem there is Before You Leave Letterfrack, and it's by Eva Burke. You'll find some of the, as you're walking down the corridor down in the hotel down here, at the end there's this very playful image of the bog with very vivid colours, like a South American painting, those kind of colours, but it's actually a painting. It's by Brian Burke, and he'd be a brother-in-law of Eva Burke. She'd be married to his brother. Now she's actually a German lady, but she's been living in Ireland for 40 years at least. And she's a really important poet in our area, and she lectured in NUIG as well in the German department. And she's a great contributor to literary matters in the west of Ireland, as an editor, as a writer, and as an encourager of young talent as well. So
What page is that on?
that's on page 43.
Thank you.
Eva Burke. Before you leave, let her frack. It's the final poem. Remember the keepsakes, collect a handful of watery light streaming through the clouds when the sea glints like black tinfoil just before rain. Bring back some smelling salts from Glashon Beach where the weather is made and the invisible has space enough to kneel before the storm. Also a scrap of blue from the deep notch in the sky between the diamond and the waterlogged hills, and cut me a specimen of reeds brown by the wind. Make your way to Tully and gather, she says Tully with her German accent, I can hear her saying it. Make your way to Tully and gather a scoop of the crimson gold of the hedgerows. Catch sight of the grey mare and her foal, take a sample of both. And if you spot the dragonfly of a two-seater looping in the distance above the islands and trailing a feather of vapour, pack that feather for me. Cross the fields to the abbey and climb to the top of the broken apse window where 3 bald-headed monks sit and chant, tapping the beat with their bare feet. Read them politely. Bring me that chant. Now,
Beautiful. Can we pause for a second?
yeah,
I want to acknowledge our friend Dina here. Is that okay? Would you like to say something about how this is moving you? Because our friend works with battered young women.
It's just,
yeah.
Is there something that you might be able to say to her about what you've done here?
Well, do you know that I suppose a morning like this is about commonalities, irrespective of what paths we travelled to come here today. It's about the common space that we all have as humans. And, you know, and we have a project there in for coming up for Sea Week, and it's called After the Light. It's a nighttime parade, and it's an old ritual of bringing the light around the village. And After the Light suggests that we are trying to move out of the darkness. We're after the light, we're running after the light. It could also mean that the light has gone because it's after the light. And we chose that title because we're just heading into Halloween. It's just the day before, 2 days before, or 3 days before Halloween. So we are actually heading into the underworld when the portals to the underworld are supposed to be more open and all of that. And so it's that into November, that month of the Holy Souls in Christian terms and all of that. And it's a much more ancient time in ancient mythology. So I suppose that's all we can do, is that we try and search for the light. We try and hold hands with people who are hurting, and you know yourself. And to have a warm, non-judgmental presence is a journey for each of us to make. And that's hard. It's easy to say it in one sentence. It's very hard to be that non-judgmental, warm presence that's available. Because we come with all our inadequacies to that space. We're short-tempered, or we're pre-programmed, or we have fixed ideas about stuff or whatever. So it's difficult our journeys, that shape us. That's one of the reasons when I came here on a personal note as well, is the sense of freedom. I was also changing my own lifestyle, stopping drinking and all of that kind of stuff, getting out of the fast lane and that kind of thing. So, and this landscape is it can either kill or cure you, like, because it isn't simple. You know, I used to swim here in the winter, and that's tough. I can tell you. And you certainly would want to be off your game a bit. And I was coming up from the beach one day, and I met this Connemara woman, and she'd be a kind of a classic Connemara woman, where they say there's French influences or Spanish, and not French, but Spanish influences in the bloodlines. And she's dark hair and big brooding eyes under her, and she was about nearly 70 at the time. I was in my mid-30s, I suppose. And she said, "Yes," she says, "I know what you're at." I thought, I'm glad somebody does. And she said,
Says, "I know what you are. I'm glad somebody does."
I know what you're at. What you're at.
What you're at. What you're at.
It sounded like as if I was Jesus, was I down there on the beach fornicating with or something? That sort of innuendo. And she said, "You're trying to get rid of your sexiness." And she was fucking bang on. Bang on. Yeah. Bullseye, I said, bullseye. That's it. Because, it's a kind of, in the winter here, it's a very primal, and you understand about the need for rutting and all of that stuff in its primitive state when you're there, you're all of the politeness that we dance around or we play minuets to or whatever. All of that stuff goes out the door with big waves and big weather and all of that stuff, and you're here facing the wall, and that kind of thing.
Evident.
It is, yeah, that's the stuff.
Thank you so much.
Not at all.
Does that help?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. It's good to know the thing in the room, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. There aren't any, there aren't simple answers. There are complex problems, and there's a lot of old pain and hurt, and stuff has to be worked through. And it's I suppose. Somebody said to me, a daughter-in-law of ours died tragically in Long Island, New York, and there was an open casket, and some people walked past the casket backwards. Would you believe that? They couldn't look at a body. They walked, actually, I'm not exaggerating now, it was like a scene out of Monty Python, except it was real, and I was part of that scene. They walked past the casket backwards. They were coming up and they didn't realise the casket was open. I wonder when they suddenly got a shock and the next thing they switched around and walked back past it. These were some of the beautiful people. The glitterati were out there. It was a kind of that sort of a occasion as well. And yeah.
Sorry, I wonder where would you say, speculate where Ireland is in the healing game?
Well, let's say I think we're in a better position now. There's a lot of stuff for us to do, and one of the things that we'll be trying to do, we have a one-day conference as this. I don't like the word conference. It's a one-day kind of talking, and some of the people there will be talking about the notion of a republic. We're chasing this concept of a republic because we're very far away. We're a banana republic at the moment, but chasing that we might become a real republic that cherishes all the people of the nation equally. And we're that was the aspiration in our constitution, but we're quite a distance from that yet. But let's say I'd be optimistic. There's a lot of brilliant young people here. My generation has failed dramatically, dramatically, I think, but there's a new generation up there. Like you can see it in the literature. There's some great young writing happening in the country at the moment, and I think there's a young generation that just maybe needs more focus and more space and more encouragement and all of that from people of my generation to say yes, the changes that we would aspire to can actually happen. They can actually happen, and they can happen quite quickly now, because lots of the sacred cows are out of sight now. No harm, and the space is freeing up. The church doesn't have the power that it had, but it still has a lot of power, still there. Every primary school in the country is owned by the church, 97% of them. People forget that, you know, and they have that for a reason, you know, because if you control those, you're still there, like, so you might be gone off the pitch in theory, and the Irish Times mightn't be giving you much space, but underneath that there's another layer, you know. So
Thank you.
anyway, but so I'm hoping that, say, if you come back again and that you'll walk the poetry trail, or if you get a chance before you go, you'll walk the poetry trail, and it makes a real, I would like to think it makes a real contact with place. You'd have a real contact with this place, and that if you do buy the book or whatever, that you have something real of our place going back with you, you know, so that it makes that connection, and when you play the CD, it would bring you back to this room as well, and back to Letterfrack.
Do we
Yeah.
purchase this from you?
Pardon?
Do we pay?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. They're a tenner each. They're normally $12.50, but
Okay.
special offer today to keep Mr. Phil on track.
Thank you so much.
That's
wonderful.
Do we? Excuse me. Excuse me. We have time for a couple of questions. Is anything moving through you that you would like to address Leo at the moment? Do you mind 5 minutes of questions or so?
I'd like to ask a question. It's not necessarily literary, but I'm moved by the fact that the community was driven to use art as an act of healing.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued about what the church and what the state did in tandem for its people as an act of healing.
Anything the state did, they were kind of pushed into it. They were brought. They weren't bouncing up to the space for healing. They were pulled into it, and the church the same. The healing happened in Letterfrack because a community group in the end of the 60s decided to purchase the building off the church and to start a community development company there, and which developed the Wood School and the Conservation Centre and the creche and all of that. It's called Connemara West, and that was where the start of all that was the big turn, I think, when that company was set up. And because at the time their intervention, even in purchasing the building, wasn't actually welcomed by the church. So the church were reluctantly handing over, even though they charged them a price, they paid for it. Even though they did, they were reluctant in handing over the premises and lands and so forth to the community. So that was the big change. I think it was a community effort that Connemara West would be, and I mentioned that in the foreword in the book, that they would be the catalyst for change. The church weren't catalyst for change, and no, they weren't. And it was it's kind of even hard for me now, even though I lived through that period. It was such a dark, repressive time. You'd say to yourself, how did this stuff go on? How did this happen? You know, but like it was a kind of like a cloud over things, and sex was a taboo subject. Didn't speak about it openly, and you know, all of the morality was around sexual morality in big letters. You know, like I remember being shocked when this guy, who was a Protestant coming from a different tradition, he was a farmer, local farmer here, and he was a big member of the Farmers Union, the IFA, Irish Farmers Association, which are a very powerful lobby group, and he was a chairman of the group here, and he was a very important voice. So he had a falling out with them, he had a row with them, and he resigned from the IFA. And he said to me, I must ring up my insurance company on Monday and tell them I'm no longer part of the group scheme and I'm no longer entitled to the 10% deposit. And I remember looking at him, Jesus almighty, I'd never have thought of that, you know, because my whole morality was only all about sex. It was never about commitment to honourable in business. Like, if you could fiddle the taxman, fair dues to you. There was no such thing as, like you say, in the North Europeans, what I find is amazing, when they you know, they pay money to the state and then they expect a service back from that. But they are honourable and they will write out how much they owe the state and they pay that over large chunks of cash. And we were brought up in a tradition like that. And then of course anybody who derides that, you talk about the nanny state and about that's a communist model and all that. When I go to America, I hear people saying that to me, oh, that's communism and all of that. But that commitment to the greater good, we, in terms of the estate and so forth, I don't know, we didn't deal very well with post-colonial stuff. We never dealt with it, in fact, really, I think. You know, we teethed it along. And you need to deal with post-colonial stuff. When I go to Long Island now, I go there, I have a son there a lot, I see the hand of the Brits still there along the island. I see levels of politeness and behaviour and all that. It is so modulated and so obviously coming from another time, you know, and not being dealt with and that stuff. And we need to deal with stuff like that, you know.
It reminds me a bit of the conversation Lady Gregory had with Yeats and Martin at Coole Park. There was so much pressure to go straight to the political revolution, and I believe it was Lady Gregory who said, let's begin with the cultural revolution. Let's take the language back. Let's found a theatre.
Yeah.
Let's start writing, telling the old stories again. We do that, we can invigorate the culture, we can reawaken the soul, and then we move into the political revolution. And part of that was the founding of the Abbey Theatre, which culturally is an enormous moment. It's a big threshold in Irish literature. Yeah. And this, I hear echoes of that in what happened out here in Letterfrack.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question about you having moved from Dublin to here?
Will my poem be
What-
pertinent here or later?
What do you feel this land, this place, what role has it played in shaping you or changing you? Moving here from another place.
Well, I suppose it gave me the space and the time and to grow up. Cause like when you're seriously drinking and that stuff, you're as a human, your evolution is stunted. You're stopped. You're in an adult body and you're behaving like a juvenile delinquent, and you are a juvenile delinquent. So when you stop whatever your poison is, whatever your addiction is, you stop that stuff, then you're faced with an immature egomaniac usually, and you do a lot of assessing, and 2 steps forward and 15 back, that kind of thing, and you stare at walls like this and that. But this place has been very good for me because I didn't feel I was hemmed in, and because I was your typical angry young man, wild and angry and all of that stuff, and no, that was and I suppose it was part of the whole 60s thing anyway, that, you know, look back and anger Osborne's work and all of that, all the writing that came from England at that time, you know.
And that's what they were called. They were called the Angry Young Men.
Yeah, so there was that, you know, and there was that feeling across the globe, I suppose, around Vietnam and everything like that. And this place gave me a space to be kind of mad enough like that, and it didn't feel that you had to be modulated into some kind of a shape that was suitable, you know. It wasn't, you didn't have to join a golf course and become a golf course person, all of that. So they didn't, you know, so it wasn't that kind of, the space was open enough so that you could be yourself and you could grow up in that space. And I think that I had 2 elderly bachelor fishermen as neighbours, and I knocked a lot of stuff out of them. And I built a house, and I know nothing about building a house. You know, actually, now that you remind me, I was actually afraid of the dark, you know. 32 years of age, I was afraid of the dark because I'd grown up in the city, like, and all of that. Suddenly you're out here and there's not a light with ages in the sky. You know, I remember going down to the beach one night, and Jesus, I went as far as the beach, and I scuttled home as fast as I could. I couldn't stick it out there, you know. So, you know, that was the journey. So, you know, the dark night of the soul, or whatever it's called, but it was that kind of a journey, and but I survived it. You know, so. And this place helped me to survive it because of that. You know, the importance of, that's a thing in my life, the importance of the non-judgmental. That people were more broad-minded here than there would have been in other areas in the country at the time. And I think, you know, they had huge waves of immigration here, and a lot of old sadness here, and maybe that shaped the space to be more kind and more tolerant anyway, you know. There's a play on at the moment now, Eugene McCabe's play in the Druid are doing it in Galway at the moment. I can't think of the name of it now. And it's set in the 50s, like, and it's a brutal play, like, it's tough play. It isn't a good play, I don't think it is. It's Druid production, which is very dramatic production, and it does some very good work in it, but I think the play itself isn't. It would need to be rewritten. But
the other great theatre in Ireland, the Abbey in Dublin, and
the Druid
in Galway.
The founder member and director of the Druid, she was the first woman to win an Emmy in the American stage. What was it for I don't think it was for the play, but it might have been for one of Brian Freen's plays.
Did she also direct the Irish-English production of The Taming of the Shrew in London?
She did, yeah.
So we saw that last year.
Yeah, we saw
So
it.
it's the same director.
Oh, really? Oh, cool.
Yeah, she's a great director. Gary Hines. She did a 6-hour big Shakespeare thing last year, and she it's a small theatre, and you assembled outside the theatre in a tent, and then as you had to walk through into this theatre, there were people digging, like grave diggers and all of that, and when you walked in, all the floor of the theatre was covered in peat. And in the battle scenes, the actual water kept down on the punters as well as on the actors, and the peat turned to mud, and when the actors were killed, they had to lie in that mud in front at your feet. So it was an amazing experience. It was actually, you know, it was the nearest thing I felt to being back in time and at a real Shakespeare where the gods were having a rough time, and we were in the experience was amazing. And you know, the wonderful thing about it was they didn't try and do this English thing like yes, it's lovely, and we have lovely weather here, and Shakespeare's here, and we have a voice, and there's nothing more than a voice. There's no emotion. It's all about the voice. I'm going to fucking murder you, but it's terribly detached, you know. And that kind of Shakespeare stuff. This was the exact opposite. This was just earthy and real, and you could feel, by God, this was theatre for the people. This wasn't for a neat, specialised, high-end audience. This was for the punters, and it was amazing. And it was 6 hours of Shakespeare. I thought, oh, jeez, I'll fall asleep. The truth, as I said to our daughter was going with us as well, and said, Jesus, I hope I'll stay awake. And it was riveting. It was so exciting because they played it for physicality and everything. You know what I mean?
Oh, great way to say it. Played it for the physicality.
Yeah.
Great.
And the language was robust. The actual action was robust, and it was her. She had, and like they so many things wrong with the space. The space was too tiny, everything. But they used gantries and all sort of different levels in the circular space. They built kind of a very modern steel gantry, and their actors running on the gantry and action happening there, and them swinging down on ropes in front of you and all of that. So it was a cross between a circus and a theatre, and it was wonderful. So they're if you get to see them at all in the States, and they do travel, and they'll probably be travelling with this play, they're worth going to see, because they take even the classics that are bet to death, some of the sing stuff that you might have seen 300 times, when they they breathe fresh life into it. You know, and the Druid, D-R-U-I-D, Druid.
And where did you see that? At the Druid?
At the Druid in Galway, yeah. But they travel they travel and they were in America last year. I know that they did that Shakespeare in America.
Yeah.
They were in the Lincoln Center.
Remember what we talked about during the tour, because we had more time and we had the coach. We actually took part of the poetry trail in Connemara Park, and several of the people on the tour were saying, "I want to do this at home." And we talked about that for the next few days. Create a poetry trail in your city, in your neighborhood. Oh, here's a volunteer right here in Salt Lake City.
We have
Could you tell Leo briefly?
we have a beautiful garden that represents the different climates in Utah, Utah being very desert-like, and it's called Red Butte Gardens, a remarkable center, and we have a poetry trail, and they every spring and fall solicit poetry from the community to be scrutinized, to be selected for inclusion in the poetry trail. So there are 12 spaces in the garden in little tent-like houses to be protected from the wind and the snow, especially the snow. No rain in Utah, and it's really delightful to go from place to place.
Lovely.
So I've submitted my poetry and was rejected twice. I'm not sure I'll try again, but it's really lovely.
Set up your own trail.
There we go. Oh, I didn't think about that. Okay.
Well, and we're doing another project there now, I think, called Sit Down with a Haiku, where because it's a furniture design college, and so we're going to design some special seating, and on we have a haiku on the seating. So the project, and then we have another thing which is fun, which you could do anywhere. I think this takes poetry out of the realm of the precious as well. November is this month where the underworld is supposed to be more accessible to the human and all that. And we have the slogan would be, in Letterfrack, in November, the haiku comes out to play. And you have to have a torch to see it because it'll be done in fluorescent light. So you have to go out at night and you go around looking, and suddenly you'll find the pub. And I had visions of them all coming out of the pub, you see, and they're saying, and they'd be saying, excuse the language now, because this is what they'll actually be saying. They'll be saying, that fucker Leo, where is he the post? Because I was talking, I thought we might have a prize, you see, anybody who could find the 6th, and then we'd have dinner for 2 somewhere, and they'd be saying, oh geez, I'm fucking going to get it. A lot of these would be past pupils of mine now, because I was teaching school here, obviously, in Letterfrack, for years, for 20-something years. So anyway,
They were lucky to have you.
Yeah, coming out of the pub with the torch saying, oh Jesus, we are going to get them. So I just thought that would be such a fun thing, and I could hear all the people, the health and safety people and the insurance people say, oh my God, you could cause an accident and people will be falling if they're half cut coming out of the pub, and they'll be falling over stones or whatever, and so be it. But it just, it kind of, I like, the sense of the absurd about it, and I also like the sense of fun about it. It's
Let's bring the fun back into poetry.
Yeah.
Boy, gosh, thank you so much.
Thank
Maria.
you.